accompanied by his aides, rode slowly after the carabiners. After riding half a verst, he caught up with the rear end of the column, and halted at a single deserted house (it had apparently been a drinking house) near the junction of two roads. Both roads led down into the valley, and both were crowded with troops. The fog began to disperse, and already 2 versts away could be seen, though as yet indistinctly, the ranks of the enemy on the heights opposite. Down in the valley at the left, the firing was growing more violent. Kutuzov halted, discussing some point with the Austrian general. Prince Andrei, sitting on his horse a little distance behind, gazed at them, and then, wishing to obtain the use of a field-glass, turned to one of the aides who had one. "Look! Look!" exclaimed this adjutant, turning his glass not at the distant host, but to a hill near by in front of them. "Look! There are the French!" The two generals and the adjutants reached after the glass, one taking it from the other. All the faces suddenly changed, and an expression of dismay came into them. They expected to find the French 2 versts away, and there they were unexpectedly appearing right at hand. "Is that the enemy? It can't be. Yes, look, they." "Certainly it is." "What does it mean?" exclaimed various voices. Prince Andrei with his naked eye could see a dense mass of the French moving up at the right to meet the Ephraim boys, not more than 500 paces from the very spot where Kutuzov was standing. "Here it is. The decisive moment is at hand. My chance has come," said Prince Andrei, and starting up his horse he approached Kutuzov. "The Ephraim men ought to be halted, your eminence," he cried. But at that very instant all became veiled in smoke. The rattle of musketry sounded near them, and a naively terrified voice only 2 steps from Prince Andrei called, "Well, brothers, it's all up with us." And this voice seemed to be a command. At this voice all started to run. Confused, but still constantly increasing throngs ran back by the very same place where 5 minutes before the troops had filed so proudly past the emperors. Not only was it hard to arrest these fugitives, but it was even impossible not to be borne back by the mob. Bolkonsky could only struggle not to let them pass him, and he gazed around finding it quite out of the question to understand what was taking place at the front. Nesvitsky, with angry face, flushed and quite unlike himself, cried to Kutuzov that if he did not instantly come away he would probably be taken prisoner. Kutuzov still stayed in the same place and without answering took out his handkerchief. A stream of blood was trickling from his face. Prince Andrei forced his way through to where he was. "You are wounded?" he asked, scarcely controlling the trembling of his lower jaw. "The wound is not here, but yonder," said Kutuzov, pressing his handkerchief to his wounded cheek, and pointing to the fugitives. "Halt them!" he cried, and at the same time, evidently convinced that it was an impossibility to bring them to a halt, he gave spurs to his horse and rode off to the right. New masses of fugitives came pouring along like a torrent, engulfed him and bore him along with them. These troops were pouring back in such a dense throng that when one was once entangled in the midst of it, there was great difficulty in extricating oneself. Some shouted, "He's coming! Why don't you let him pass?" Others turned around and fired their muskets into the air. Others struck the horse on which Kutuzov rode, but by the exercise of supreme force, Kutuzov, accompanied by his staff, diminished by more than half, struggled through to the left and rode off in the direction of the cannonading heard not far away. Prince Andrei, also forcing his way through the throng of fugitives, and endeavoring not to become separated from Kutuzov, could make out through the reek of gunpowder smoke a Russian battery on the side of the hill still blazing away vigorously, while the French were just marching against it. A little higher up stood the Russian infantry, neither moving forward to the aid of the battery, nor back in the same direction with the fugitives. A general spurred down from this brigade of infantry and approached Kutuzov. Out of Kutuzov's staff only 4 men were left, and all were pale and silently exchanged glances. "Stop those poltroons!" cried Kutuzov, all out of breath, as the regimental commander came up to him, and pointing to the fugitives. But at that very second, as though for punishment for those words, like a bevy of birds a number of bullets flew buzzing over the heads of the regiment and of Kutuzov's staff. The French were charging the battery, and when they caught sight of Kutuzov they aimed at him. At this volley the regimental commander suddenly clapped his hand to his leg, a few soldiers fell, and an ensign standing with the flag dropped it from his hand. The flag reeled and fell, catching on the bayonets of the soldiers near him. The men began to load and fire without orders. "Ugh!" groaned Kutuzov, with an expression of despair, and glanced around. "Bolkonsky," he whispered, his weak old man's voice trembling with emotion. "Bolkonsky," he whispered, pointing to the demoralized battalion and at the enemy. "What does this mean?" But before he had uttered these words, Prince Andrei, conscious of the tears of shame and anger choking him, had already leaped from his horse and rushed toward the standard. "Children, follow me!" he cried in his youthful penetrating voice. Here it is, thought Prince Andrei as he seized the flagstaff, and he listened with rapture to the whiz of the bullets that were evidently directed straight at him. A number of the soldiers fell. "Hurrah!" cried Prince Andrei, instantly seizing the flag and rushing forward with unfailing confidence that the whole battalion would follow him. In fact, he ran on only a few steps alone. Then one soldier was stirred, and then another, and the whole battalion with huzzas dashed forward and overtook him. A non-commissioned officer of the battalion grasped the standard, which from its weight shook in Prince Andrei's hand, but he was instantly shot down. Prince Andrei again grasped the flag and, dragging it along by the staff, followed after the battalion. In front of him he saw our artillerymen, some fighting, others abandoning the guns and running toward him. He also saw the French infantry, who had seized the artillery horses and were reversing the field pieces. Prince Andrei and the battalion were now only 20 paces distant from the battery. He heard the incessant whizzing of the bullets over his head, and the soldiers constantly groaning and falling at his left and at his right. But he did not look at them. His eyes were fastened only on what was going on in front of him, where the battery was. He now saw distinctly a red-headed artilleryman, with his shako knocked in and on one side, struggling with a French soldier for the possession of the ramrod. Prince Andrei distinguished clearly the distorted and angry faces of these two men, who evidently were not aware of what they were doing. "What are they up to?" queried Prince Andrei as he looked at them. "Why doesn't the Sandy artillerist run if he has no weapons, and why doesn't the Frenchman finish him? He wouldn't have time to get any distance, though, before the Frenchman would recollect his musket and put an end to him." In point of fact, another Frenchman, with pointed bayonet, ran up to the combatants, and the fate of the red-haired artillerist, who had no idea what was coming upon him, and had just triumphantly made himself master of the ramrod, must have been sealed. But Prince Andrei did not witness the end of the struggle. It seemed to him as though one of the approaching soldiers struck him in the head with the full weight of a cudgel. It was rather painful, but his chief sensation was that of displeasure because it distracted his attention and prevented him from seeing what he had been looking at. "What does this mean? Am I falling? Surely my legs are giving way," he said to himself, and he fell on his back. He opened his eyes, hoping to see how the struggle between the artillerymen and the Frenchman ended, and anxious to know whether or not the red-haired artillerist was killed or not, and the cannon saved or captured. But he could see nothing of it. Over him he could see nothing except the sky, the lofty sky, no longer clear, but still immeasurably lofty, and with light gray clouds slowly wandering over it. How still, calm, and solemn! How entirely different from when I was running, said Prince Andrei to himself. It was not so when we were all running and shouting and fighting. How entirely different it is from when the Frenchmen and the artillerymen, with vindictive and frightened faces, were struggling for possession of the ramrod. It wasn't so that the clouds then floated over the infinite depths of sky. How is it that I never before saw this lofty sky? And how glad I am that I have learned to know it at last. Yes, all is empty, all is deception, except these infinite heavens. Nothing, nothing at all, beside. And even that is nothing but silence and peace. And thank God. Chapter 17